In this video, we're going to be walking through the illicit consent grant attack in Azure, or OAuth access token theft, which is basically being able to access a user's account by stealing the OAuth access token. The reason I personally like this attack is it bypasses MFA, and you actually don't even need to know the user's password either. It's a phishing attack, so all we need to know is the user's email, and we can actually get access to the account, get access to the emails, get access to the files. This is a pretty popular attack in Azure environments. It's used by all sorts of threat actors, including nation state groups or APT groups. And yeah, let's get started. I'll explain it further as we go through the demo. First thing I want to do is introduce our target for the video, which is Edgar at voteinternational.com. We're actually just going to log into his account this is from the target's perspective. Let's just pretend we're sitting at the target's computer. And I've logged in with his email and password. And I just want to confirm that Edgar is actually using MFA. So we're going to need to put in his two-factor access token, which is just a code from his device. And yeah, that's all I wanted to do, just to prove that Edgar, our target in this case, is actually using multi-factor authentication. And we're going to log into Office 365, where you should have the usual applications there. And I'm going to open his Outlook and his OneDrive as well, because those are the two applications I'm going to primarily be targeting. So Outlook for email, OneDrive for files, which are pretty popular. And then now what we're going to do is switch to the attacker's perspective. So let's just forget all about Edgar for a moment. The attacker in this case has no information about Edgar other than his username that he's gotten from, the usual OSINT and recon. So we've already introduced our target here, Edgar, and now we're going to step into the attacker's shoes and set up the attack from scratch to get access to Edgar's emails and files. What we're going to do is, the first step is we're going to create a malicious application which is going to request certain API permissions from Edgar. These are just a few samples of some of the API permissions we can request. We're then going to send a phishing link to Edgar, the target, and what's going to happen here is Edgar's going to receive a prompt once he clicks on our phishing link. That's basically going to be asking him to give this malicious application under our control permissions to access his account using these APIs that we requested here. If Edgar does say yes to the prompt, we're going to get an access token and a refresh token, which we can then use to access Edgar's data, files, emails, profile information. And all this will happen without needing to know anything else about Edgar's profile, including his username, including his password or his multi-factor token. So yeah, we will come back to this diagram just a bit later on as the demo goes forward, but I just wanted to explain it. We're going to walk through the steps one by one, though I won't necessarily set up everything live, just in the interest of time. So I'm just highlighting, we're going to start with the first step, which is creating the malicious app. In Azure, we're going to create a malicious, should mention this is the target tenant, the attacker tenant, Butcher International, and our attacking user in this case is Billy Butcher, or Billy at BillyButcherInternational.com. And then what we're going to do is hit the app registrations menu. This is where you create enterprise applications in Azure tenants. We can see I already have an app here, Office 365 upgrade, which is what we're going to use. But before we do, I just want to show a very important step. When you are creating an app to begin with, you're going to need to give it a name. Just for example, blah blah. And the most crucial thing here is that you pick either option 2 or 3, because the default setting for an app is that it's single tenant, meaning it can only be used in this tenant, the tenant it was created in. But remember, this is an app that we're targeting a separate tenant. We're in the Butcher International tenant, and we're targeting the Vote International tenant. So we need to create an app that's multi-tenant, an app that can be used against cross-tenant. So either option 2 or 3 will do. You just want to make sure you don't leave it on option 1. That's all I wanted to show. We can actually close the registration because I've already created my application in this case. So just remember option 2 or 3, and as long as it's a multi-tenant app, we should be fine. we're going to go back to the app that I've already created here, Office 365 upgrade. Um, yeah, so I gave it the name that, just to make it sound legitimate, something that a user would possibly fall for. So Office 365 upgrade. You're even allowed to configure your application with an icon or a logo, which I just downloaded an Office 365 logo from the internet and configured it to that. Then just put in a home page and other things. You can put additional information, but since it's a demo, I just put the most basic information required. And yeah, so next up, what we want to do, another very crucial step when configuring your app is the API permissions we're going to request from the user, which we can see here in that section, step 2. What we really want to do here is come to the API permissions menu, and you can configure all sorts of API permissions. I've already configured the application with some. These are the API permissions that this malicious app is going to request from the user. So you can see the name of the APIs here. We can see the descriptions, which are pretty straightforward. So you can make the app request as many as possible. And this status is also important, admin consent required. So what admin consent required means is when you do send this malicious application to the user, if they don't have permissions within within their tenant to give permissions to third-party applications, then they'd have to request it from an admin. So you really want to stay away from these, the ones that say yes, the ones that say admin consent required, yes. You want to stay away from them unless you know the user you're targeting is actually an admin, which unless you've done proper enumeration, might be hard to tell. So I usually do try and avoid any applications. Also sensitive API permissions are configured with admin consent required, yes. So say something like changing other users' permissions. That would be something that's an admin API permission, which I try to avoid. All right. So now we've configured the application, and the API permissions we configured there is what Edgar is gonna see once the application is actually sent to him. But we'll see that later on in the demo. There's no need to go through it in too much detail right now. All right. So we need to move on to the next step, which is actually preparing a phishing link to send to Edgar. And we could do this manually, but it takes a bit of a tedious process. So we're going to use this tool called OAuth, which is a tool for managing OAuth phishing campaigns. It currently only supports Office 365, but it could be configured or upgraded to abuse other services. But for the moment, we're using Office 365, which is fortunately what we're targeting. It's a pretty old tool, but I really do like it. It still works really well. It's over from the folks at Mandiant. So yeah, I've already set this up on my domain, which you can see up here, area66.net. I already set it up, and this is a screen where you configure the OAuth with your app's details. So I'm going to walk through these steps one by one just to show where you can get this information when configuring OAuth. Alright, the first thing is pretty straightforward, which is just the name of the app, which we already have. Just to reiterate, we're using OAuth to manage the phishing campaign, and the first step of the phishing campaign is to generate a phishing link to use. So again, let's just start configuring it. First thing is pretty straightforward, the name. We already know the name of the app, so we're just going to paste it in there. The redirect URL is basically the URL that's going to capture the access token we're going to need from the user once we do actually phish them. We're going to need to capture that token somehow. And the open redirect URL is, you see this OAuth API Microsoft callback. This is hard-coded into OAuth, but it can be changed if you'd like to. All you need to do is once you set it up on a domain or IP address, you're just going to append the domain name, which in my case is area66.net. We're going to append that URL there in the redirect URL parameter. Next up is the client ID, which is you can just get from the your application's details page. Authorization URL and token URL, pretty straightforward. These ones are just like default Microsoft URLs for API token generation, submission, that kind of stuff. They usually don't change. If you want to see them, just go to your app's detail overview page, the same place where you got your application ID, and click on endpoints, and we can see there are quite a number of API URLs and endpoints, and we're just going to need the first two, the authorization endpoint and the token endpoint. They don't change frequently, so all we're going to need to do is come paste them both in here. Then client secret is next, and this one, it's kind of like think of it as like a password for your application, which I'm not going to show here because it's confidential information. I don't expose the password for this application, even if I'll delete it after the demo. But when you do want to create one, you just come to the clients and secrets menu, create one, and then paste the value of the password into that field. So all you need to do is just come to this clients and secrets, create a password for your app, a credential for your app, and then once you do have that credential, you can configure OAuth with it. Scopes is also very important. This is basically just the names of all the API permissions we were requesting. Um, we had seen them earlier in the API permissions menu. So here they are, the API permissions. So it's the same thing, but we're just going to put them in OAuth with only the name and the comma separated. So one API permission, a comma, second API permission, comma, and we move on just like that. And last, which is a redirect URL, the conclude redirect, which is basically once the user approves the permissions to the application we're going to send them, where do they get redirected to? I do just tend to use office.com because I assume since I'm targeting office.com, I assume the user is already logged in there. So once they do the phishing attacks is successful, they get redirected to Office, which hopefully won't be too suspicious. Yeah, we've put in everything. Now all we need to do is click on the go button, and of course you're going to do your validations and stuff, but we're just going to click go. And yeah, what happens here is it just outputs basically everything you've put in a JSON file, in JSON output. But the thing we really need here is the authorization URL full. This wasn't part of the things we configured here. What this is a phishing link that we're going to need to send to the target user. It's a pretty long URL, as we can see. It includes pretty much all the details that we've configured earlier. So we're going to copy that whole long link and open Outlook from the attacker's perspective. So that's the first step using OAuth, generating the phishing link, but we'll also use it to access the user's data in the next step. So we're going to open Outlook from the attacker's perspective. The email is pretty straightforward. Of course, in the real world, you probably want to invest a bit more in this kind of phishing campaign. But basically, since our app is an Office 365 app, we're just going to request the user, our target user, Edgar, at Vote International, to please upgrade his Office app. And I've hyperlinked the word here. I've hyperlinked the word here with the URL we just copied. I'd already prepared this email in the interest of time, but that URL we got from OAuth, I just hyperlinked the word here, and now we can send it. So we're just gonna send the email and wait for it to be delivered. Shouldn't take too long. Just gonna check the sent items to make sure the email has been delivered. We can see it there. Great. Now let's leave the attacker's perspective and go back to our target, Edgar in this case. So we're back in Edgar's account, and we can see here the email from our attacker has actually been received. So let's see, just verifying that we're back in Edgar's perspective. And there we go, there's the email. It's the same email we just saw. So let's see what happens when Edgar does click on here, the here button, the hyperlinked here button. Should open a new window, a new tab. And here we are. The most important bit from, at least from the phishing perspective, is this. This is why it's called the illicit consent grant, because now it's basically the application we created, the Office 365 upgrade, is requesting the user Edgar these permissions from his account. And if you look closely, you can tell these are just the same API permissions we had created earlier. So if you had put, 20 API permissions, all of them would appear here. And this is why I was saying you just want to invest quite a bit in your social engineering campaign and hopefully create an attack that a user would like to approve. Of course, because I don't have a legitimate developer account, it's not a verified app, but this thing still works. So Let's just assume Edgar thinks it's a legitimate upgrade and does click accept. If it's successful, it should get redirected back to office.com, as we see there, which is great. So at least, of course, the attacker at this point wouldn't know what's actually happening on the victim side, the target side. So we're just gonna switch back to the attacker, who we assume has, been going through the regular anxiety of waiting to see if the phishing attack is successful. What you wanna do here is OAuth doesn't have any automatic notifications or anything like that. So it's kind of just one of those tools where you have to constantly reload the page to see if anything's happening. So we're just going to open a new tab, which should also create, for OAuth, just the home folder. You want to select the API you're targeting. Like I mentioned, it currently only supports Office 365. So we're going to click Office 365. And just like that, that is with how you know an attack is successful with OAuth. Um, it wouldn't have done this if a user hadn't agreed to the attack. But if we see it's already auto-filled, a user's information. So we're just going to click go, and we can see that it's again JSON output. It's not a pretty tool by any means, but it does work. I do like it, and because it's JSON output, it could be a nice UI could be built around it. So depending on how many users we targeted, we'd see all the details here, assuming the attack was successful. But since it's just one user, what we're gonna do now is switch to the victim module to try and get Edgar's access token. And there we see the access token and the refresh token have been outputted. Now with this, we can more or less access Edgar's account. If we go back to the diagram and we see here in the step where if Edgar approves the permissions from the malicious app, an access token will be generated and sent to the attacker. That access token is what we're seeing right above. Well, we've just previously seen the access and refresh token. This is how we actually are able to access Edgar's account and files and emails without his knowledge and without needing to know his password or his MFA token. I'm just going to use OAuth to confirm this. So we can see the tokens there, but that's not the fun part. Let's get to the exfiltrating data. The messages module in OAuth is used to access a user's emails, assuming, of course, you've compromised them. And it does have a search functionality, which is very useful. So instead of just outputting all emails, you can actually search for emails with specific text. I'm going to use credential, which is a pretty common word that I like to search in users' emails once I get access to the inboxes. And again, we can see it's just raw output. It's like I said, it's not a pretty tool, but if we just scroll a bit further down, we can see that the subject of the email is here, my personal credentials. And a bit further down should be the body of the email. So it does take some reading, but yeah, there we go, the body of the email. And we can see it's outputted in raw HTML format. So I'm just going to copy the whole thing, the whole email, the whole HTML body. I'm going to open a text editor, Sublime, and copy paste the whole HTML file in it. Most modern emails are just rendered HTML. So what I'm doing here is just saving the file in a temporary file, saving the email in a temporary file so we can at least view it in a pretty rendered way. And there it is. There's the full email. You can see just Edgar's LastPass email, LastPass password, his bank account number, and bank account password. Now what I want to do is switch to Edgar's perspective, the target perspective, to see if that email actually exists. And we can see that, yeah, there actually is an email like that in Edgar's inbox. So just to prove the attack was successful, we can actually see there are legitimate emails in Edgar's Outlook. Now we're going to switch to Edgar's OneDrive, just to prove that we can also access his files without his knowledge. So he has a bunch of, this is Edgar's organizational OneDrive. In the real world, it'd probably be full of documents, sensitive information, the kind of stuff you'd really want to get access to as a pen tester or a red teamer. But in this case, I've just put in some wallpapers, some pictures for the sake of the demo. I'm just going to open one so we can verify that we actually can download a file from the attacker's perspective. And yeah, this is the demo image. Looks like Edgar is a fan of anime. Must be a pretty cool guy. So yeah, let's close this and then switch back to the attacker's perspective and see if we can actually access that file. Alright, so we're gonna close the email. Now we're gonna switch to the Drive module, which is used to access a user's OneDrive, assuming you have the access token, which we do for Edgar. This time I'm not gonna search for anything. You still can search, but if you do leave the search parameter empty, it will just output everything it can find in Edgar's OneDrive. And just like that, pretty quick, we can see it's already outputted results from the search. And again, it's raw output, not pretty, but if you look closely, we can see the names of some of those files we had seen earlier. You can see here's like a name, but I'm gonna look for that specific one that we had seen earlier. I believe it was called mist something something. I think it had mist in the title. So I'm just gonna search on the web page for the title mist, and we can see there it is. There's the file we were looking at earlier. The HP something mist. It's a PNG wallpaper. Now let's try and download it. And what you want to do when you're downloading files is use this Microsoft Graph download URL and then copy the whole URL. It's a pretty long URL that includes a temporary access token for the file that OAuth has generated for us. So we don't need to actually do anything other than copy that URL and paste it in a new tab, and it should automatically download the file for us. So just like that, it's downloaded the file. Let's open it to confirm, and we do see that the file has been downloaded from Edgar's account. And I should just to reiterate that we've been able to do this all without needing anything other than Edgar's email, or we didn't need his password, we didn't need his MFA token, but we are able to access his account, access his files, and access his email. So it's a pretty dangerous attack and still being abused to the day.